15. Seagrove settled deeper into the economically designed command seat of the Lamb. It had been a long time since he'd felt the craft's raw strength under him, and he reveled in the power that vibrated through his being. It was wonderful. Above him, the blue sky also seemed to vibrate with happiness. He thought about rolling the Phoenix Hawk over into a vertical dive over the campsite. Wouldn't that give those ground-bound slugs a thrill? But he thought better of it. He needed to test the control response. He needed to relearn the process of flying. He pushed forward on the starboard control arm and brought the Lamb to level flight. The Lamb's cockpit was crammed with levers, switches, gauges, and lights. The Phoenix Hawk, designed to fly like a bird and walk like a man, had the controls for both modes. A standard mech was a complicated piece of equipment with control sticks for both hands. The joystick, which sat between the pilot's legs and was controlled by his right hand, took care of movement vector as well as the weapon aiming systems. The left hand controlled speed and gross balance. The neuro helmet, specifically designed to react to the nervous system of the pilot, responded with sighting and fine balance. On the dashboard in front of the pilot was the weapon's targeting system, spectral analysis panel, sensor array, radar plot, IR plot, and communication system. The gauges and sensors that reported on the status of the mech's various control systems were also laid out in convenient clusters. Dials and digital displays would indicate the status of heat buildup, a nasty problem for all mechs, as well as the status of heat sinks, ammunition, fuel, lubrication temperature, and power output. Across the bottom of the panel, just above the pilot's knees, was a ground status sensor display, which was designed as a plot plan indicator readout, much like a standard radar or IR screen. But instead of showing specific objects, the plot showed the perceived condition of the ground in and around the mech. Direct observation of the ground was a problem for a mech pilot. The ground status sensor felt the ground even before the mech placed its feet down, warning the pilot, both through the color of the display and a warning klaxon if necessary, about the solidity of the ground surface. Most pilots learned to sense the shifts in color that rippled across the display. Really good pilots could make their mechs run at very high speeds without consciously consulting the terrain sensors. Pilots who could do that commanded machines like the light Locust mechs. Good peripheral vision and a fine sense of balance were what those required. All the controls and sensors for a ground-bound mech filled the normal cockpit. The Phoenix Hawk had those as well as the controls for a flying weapons platform. Because the mech had been designed to fulfill both functions, the controls remained in the cockpit. When the system was in flight mode, the normal joystick was locked in the neutral position and the controls for the Hawk were activated. The flight control system used dual control wands in much the same way that the ground system did. Instead of having the central control between the pilot's legs, the wand hinged from a bar that rose on the starboard side of the cockpit. The top of the bar was a hinged stick that dropped across the right leg, and placed so that the pilot's right hand dropped naturally onto the bar. The back of the hand and the first joints held the stick under control, and there were 5 buttons for triggering the weapons with fingers and thumb. The left hand had a similar bar that maintained flight speed and engine power output. On either side of the display were the readouts for the Hawk system. The designers had fought over which systems should have the central position, and the designers of the Phoenix had eventually won. They had reasoned that the mech would spend most of its time on the ground, and therefore the ground systems should have priority. Seagroves didn't agree. Even if he spent most of his time on the ground, he only came alive when he was in the air. That was living. That was power. That was reality. The designers were desk-bound gnomes who used their brains to solve problems. They hadn't asked a pilot what he wanted, and so they'd solved their design problems with calculators and computer graphics. So what if it all worked fine on their computer screens? Real life was different. Seagrove let his eyes sweep over the dials and readouts. Every 15 seconds his eyes made the sweep from upper left, across the top of the displays, down the right side, and then across the board to the starting point. It was not a conscious act, and there was no requirement that he understand what each dial represented. The systems had been placed on the panel so that all the indicator arrows pointed in the same direction to be green. All that the eye saw and the brain recorded was a mass of little wands pointing the same way. It didn't matter if the dials were upside down, cocked to the right, or cocked to the left. As long as the arrows were in the same direction, then Seagrooves knew he had a good panel. As a trained and experienced pilot, his eyes made the sweep every 15 seconds. Some pilots never got the routine, but most of those were buried by now, 6 feet under. There were old pilots and bold pilots, but there were no old, bold pilots. Seagroves was daring when he had to be, but he was as safety conscious as the best of them. That was how Lamb pilots became an experienced Lamb pilot. Seagroves was experienced and intended to stay that way. He rocked the Lamb left and right, feeling the response and noting that the controls were a little sluggish when commands to move to the left. He didn't know whether it was the Lamb or his stiffness at the controls, but his subconscious noted the hitch in the movement, storing the information away for future reference. He would have to check the systems when he landed. Pitch and yaw controls were checked as well, and his eyes continued to make their sweep across the panel. Good board, good board, good board. Seagroves had been slouching along at 450 kilometers per hour, headed west, ever since gaining level flight. The Lamb was trimmed in a slight nose-up attitude and had been gaining altitude as it traversed the ground. The system check complete, he turned his attention to the mission. With the Lamb's throttle forward, nose up, Seagroves brought it to an altitude of 10,000 meters, or 10 angles, at 900 kilometers per hour. He punched in the look-down sensor array and watched the screen blossom with ground configuration and infrared signatures. 3 distinct targets appeared at once. Those were the enclaves he was looking for. He pointed the nose north and began his first sweep. He remembered the instructions of both Takuda and Boast. The desk commander wanted high reconnaissance only. Boast wanted to get down and dirty. No sense committing the Lamb to a slow pass until he had some information. Seagroves reached forward and toggled the ground flight recorder. From now on, what he saw, it would see. What he did, it would record. All 3 enclaves were as had initially been described by the furry alien. Great systems of moats and walls extended from the banks of the broad river to enclose the central metropolitan areas. The northernmost enclave was laid out in a square system of roads with large central plazas at regular intervals. From 10 angles, Seagroves could see dots of green that indicated vegetation placed at regular intervals between the broad streets. At the center of the enclave stood a huge building, the roof reflecting red. The sensor display recorded a multi-storied building in a pagoda style reminiscent of some of the government buildings favored by the Draconis Combine. The structure, castle, was surrounded by a broad park with a triple wall beyond. Very regular, very strong, very secure. Seagroves rolled the Lamb away from the enclave and turned south along the west bank of the river. The next settlement had the same wall and moat system guarding its eastern, landward side. The configuration was different from the first one, but the extent of the works was identical. The roads within the final wall were not laid out in the 4-square pattern of the first, but looked like a giant pond of water lilies, the centers of the flowers surrounded by looping roads that formed the petals. The flowers were laid out in concentric circles that surrounded and were surrounded by a larger pattern with a huge central edifice. The scanner showed another multi-storied building, but unlike the castle in the earlier enclave, this building was lower and considerably more sprawling. The entire structure was surrounded by paired pillars that supported inverted arches. There were significant open spaces within the enclosure, and many of the gardens were set on the various roofs of the building itself. The central structure was a windowless dome in the geometrical center of the compound and the enclave. The third enclave repeated the walls and moat, but the entire system was a jumble of defensive works. Any attacker would find himself in a defense system that made no apparent sense at all. Seagroves noted that there were portions of the moat that seemed to have silted over to form bright green marshes. Other portions were better maintained, and some of the walls were guarded by massive towers and outguards. Within the walls, the look of the defenses was equally chaotic. The streets were laid out with no apparent geometrical pattern. They were short and broad and began and ended for no apparent reason. Many of the structures had no streets at all between them, just narrow alleys. There was no central building like those in the other enclaves, but several dominating structures instead. Each of the larger buildings had its own defense system of walls and moats, but like the ones that guarded the entire enclave, they showed various states of repair and construction. The situation here did not look too promising. Seagroves continued south along the river for 10 minutes and then turned the Lamb back north. He had accomplished the mission according to Takuta's orders. Now was the time to do what Vost wanted. He toggled off the ground flight recorder. From now on, what he saw, only he would see. There would be no official record of his actions. He decoupled the entire flight record system, noting the inertial plot indicator readout for future reference. He would return to the spot, or close to it, before he reactivated the record. He could always claim a system malfunction if he got the plot a little off the mark. Systems were known to fail. Takuta would never know what happened. The desk commander, like every other member of his strike team, was qualified to pilot a mech, but he was not experienced in a Lamb. Besides, the old fellow had other things to worry about. Seagroves rolled the Lamb into a split S and took her down. This would be seat of the pants flying at its best. With all the record-keeping systems deactivated, there would be no readouts in the cockpit. The pilot checked the weather and visibility. And down he went. The Lamb leveled off at 200 meters and throttled down to 300 kilometers per hour. Seagrove saw no use in blasting across the terrain so fast he couldn't see anything. Even at this speed, he had to keep the Lamb well nosed up to maintain control. The chaotic wall system of the southern enclave flashed beneath his wings, and he was over the city proper. From the people down below, Seagroves got the reaction that he'd expected. They either stood and gaped, or ran for the protection of the building. Seagroves streaked across the sky, leaving behind a trail of excitement and awe. The northern section of wall passed beneath his wings. Nothing unexpected so far, except something among the jumble of streets and buildings had caught his attention. It was something he knew he should think about, but he couldn't get a clear image in his mind. He rolled the Lamb over and made another pass above the roofs of the city. And now he knew. There was gold everywhere. Seagroves felt his heart leap in his chest. Gold. Of that there was no doubt, and it was all over the city. He felt the sweat springing from the palms of his hands. He started to shake. He looked for a place to set the Lamb down. Just ahead was an opening among the buildings. He needed a bigger area to put the Lamb down, but caution had fled. Seagroves pulled back on the control bar, reached forward to toggle the Phoenix system. He felt the shudder of the mech's legs coming down. There was a jolt as the huge metal feet touched something solid.